On the morning Adeline Thorne turned 19, the sky over Boulder, Colorado was the color of wet cement. Not gray, not white. Something in between. Something that had not yet decided whether the day would matter. She stood at the end of a cracked concrete walkway holding everything she owned in a single faded canvas backpack. Behind her, the heavy steel door of the Boulder County Transitional Youth Center clicked shut. It was not a loud sound. It was the kind of sound a door makes when it has decided you are no longer its problem. For 4 years, that building had been her whole world. Bunk beds in shared rooms. Plastic trays in a cafeteria that always smelled faintly of bleach. Curfews and check-ins and caseworkers who tried their best, but always seemed tired around the eyes. Now she was legally an adult, which in practical terms meant exactly one thing. She had nowhere to go. Addie pulled the strap of her backpack higher on her shoulder and counted what she had. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a worn paperback copy of a novel her mother used to read aloud to her, a toothbrush, and $43 folded carefully inside a flat brown wallet. $43 in a manila envelope a social worker had pressed into her hands 20 minutes earlier. From the probate office, the woman had said. Something about your grandfather, her grandfather. Addie had not heard those words spoken aloud in 10 years. 10 years exactly. She was 9 the last time she saw him standing at the edge of a gravel driveway, his hands buried in the pockets of a heavy canvas work jacket. She remembered the shape of him more than the face. Broad shoulders, a pocket knife clipped to his belt. The way he had crouched down to her eye level when he spoke, slow and patient, like every word mattered. After that day, he simply disappeared from her life. No phone calls, no birthday cards, no explanation. Her father had never spoken his name again. And when her father vanished too, 2 years later, there was no one left who would. Addie crossed the parking lot to a wooden bench beneath a leafless oak. The wind cut clean through her thin jacket. She sat down and laid the envelope across her lap. For a long moment, she just looked at it. The paper was cream-colored and slightly yellowed at the edges. Across the front, in a neat black typewritten line, someone had printed her full legal name. Adeline May Thorne, not Addie. Not the nickname every counselor and caseworker had used since she was 12. The full name the way her mother used to say it when she was calling her to the dinner table. She slid her thumb under the flap and opened it. Inside were 3 things. A folded letter on legal stationery, a hand-drawn map on a square of brown paper that looked like it had been torn from a builder's notebook, and a small white index card with a single line of handwriting in faded blue ink. She picked up the letter first. The header read, Holden Pierce, Attorney at Law, with an address in a town called Pine Hollow she had never heard of. The letter was short. It informed her that her late grandfather, Silas Eldon Thorne, had left her a parcel of land in the Pine Hollow Township, and that the property could be claimed in person by the named beneficiary upon presentation of valid identification. There was one more line at the bottom of the page, and her eyes caught on it the way fabric catches on a nail. The transfer of title requires payment of $10 in back taxes. $10. She read it again, then again. $10. A cup of coffee at the gas station across the street cost almost $4. A bus ticket to Denver cost $12. and someone was telling her that an entire piece of land somewhere in the mountains of Colorado could be hers for $10. That meant one of two things. Either it was a mistake, or the land was so worthless that the county simply wanted it off their books. Addie picked up the index card. The handwriting on it was careful and slow, the letters slightly slanted to the right. She knew without being told that it was her grandfather's writing. She did not know how she knew. She just did. The card read, "If you came this far, come a little farther." That was all. No signature, no explanation. She sat there on the cold wooden bench for a very long time. The clouds above her shifted, and a thin sliver of sunlight broke through just enough to warm one side of her face. She thought about the $43 in her wallet. She thought about the shelter on Pearl Street, where she could sleep for free for maybe 2 weeks before they would tell her to move on. She thought about the way the social worker had looked at her that morning. Not unkindly. Just the way you look at someone you have already started to forget. And then she thought about the $10. $10 was not much of a risk. Even with almost nothing left in the world, 10 still felt small compared to the alternative. And the alternative was a long, slow disappearance into the kind of life that swallowed up girls like her, without ever bothering to ask their names. Addie folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. She tucked the envelope into the front pocket of her backpack, zipped it closed, and stood up. The wind moved through the bare branches above her with a dry rustling sound almost like a voice. She walked to the bus station 3 blocks away and bought a one-way ticket west into the mountains. The ticket cost her $10.75. She paid in crumpled bills and exact change, and when the woman behind the glass slid the ticket across the counter, Addie looked at it for a long moment before picking it up. Pine Hollow. The name sounded like something out of a children's book, the kind of place that might not really exist. She had no way of knowing yet that everything her life had been until that moment was about to end, and everything it would become was about to begin. The bus left at 11:15. It was an old Greyhound, the kind with cracked leather seats, and a faint chemical smell that never quite went away. Addie chose a window seat near the back. The driver, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache, gave her a long look as she boarded, but said nothing. There were only 4 other passengers, all of them older, all of them silent. Addie pressed her forehead against the cold glass and watched Boulder shrink behind her as the bus climbed the first long ridge of the foothills. The road curved up into the mountains in slow, patient turns. Snow still clung to the shaded hollows beneath the pine trees, and the rivers along the highway ran high and gray with snowmelt. Every few miles a small town would appear, and then vanish behind them. Lyons, Estes, Allen Spark, each one smaller than the last, each one more silent. The world up here did not announce itself. It just was. Addie kept the manila envelope on her lap the whole time. Every so often she opened it and looked at the index card again. If you came this far, come a little farther. She tried to remember the sound of her grandfather's voice. She could remember the shape of it, deep and slow and careful. But the actual sound had been worn smooth by time, like a stone in a river. 10 years was a long time, long enough for a voice to go quiet inside you. She tried not to think about why he had stopped coming. For most of her life, Addie had constructed a small, simple story about her grandfather. He had not wanted her. He had been a hard man who did not care for children. Or he had been ill. Or he had moved far away and forgotten she existed. The story changed depending on her age and her mood. But the shape of it was always the same. He had left her behind. People left her behind. That was simply how the world worked. But sitting on that bus with the mountains rising on either side and the envelope warm against her thighs, Addie felt the edges of that old story begin to soften. He had left her a piece of land. A man who did not care did not leave you a piece of land. The bus pulled into Pine Hollow just before 3 in the afternoon. The depot was nothing more than a wooden bench beneath a metal awning attached to the side of a small diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "Eat," in red and white. Addie stepped down onto the cracked asphalt and looked around. Pine Hollow was smaller than small. A single main street 2 blocks long. A hardware store on one corner with a hand-painted sign that read, "Whitlock's." A diner. A general store. A post office no bigger than a shed. A brick building at the far end with a brass plaque beside the door. The mountains rose up behind everything dark and enormous. The kind of mountains that had stood there long before any of these buildings and would stand there long after. She walked toward the brick building. The brass plaque read, "Holden Pierce, Attorney at Law." Addie pushed the door open. A small bell chimed somewhere above her. The hallway inside smelled of paper and pipe smoke and old wood. A staircase led up to the second floor. To her right, a frosted glass door stood ajar. "Come in," a voice called from inside. A man's voice, soft but firm. The voice of someone who had spent a long time being listened to. She stepped inside. Holden Pierce was seated behind a heavy oak desk in a small, warmly lit office. He was older than she had expected. 70 at least, maybe more. His hair was white and combed neatly back from a high forehead. His suit was gray and well-pressed, but the cuffs were slightly worn. Behind him, a tall bookshelf sagged under the weight of leather-bound legal volumes, and on the wall hung a single-frame photograph of a much younger man in a graduation gown. Pierce himself, Addie guessed, from a long time ago. He looked up from a stack of papers, and his eyes settled on her face. Something passed across his expression. Not surprise, recognition. He had known the moment she walked through the door who she was. "You must be Miss Thorne," he said quietly. Addie nodded. She did not trust her voice yet. "Please, sit." She lowered herself into the wooden chair across from his desk and let her backpack slide to the floor beside her. Pierce studied her for a long moment without speaking. There was a kindness in his eyes, but also something else. Something heavier. Something that looked for just a moment like grief. "Forgive me," he said at last. "You look very much like your father did at your age." Addie's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. No one had mentioned her father to her in years. Not by name, not by likeness. "You knew him." Pierce gave a small, careful nod. "I knew your grandfather better. But yes, I knew your father too. Briefly. A long time ago." He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder. He laid it gently on the desk between them, as if it were something fragile. "Your grandfather acquired the property in the spring of 1991, he said. He purchased it outright with his own savings, and he held it for the rest of his life. It is undeveloped land as far as the county is concerned. There is one structure on it, an old metal building the records listed as an agricultural outbuilding. There are no utilities, no registered road access. The nearest paved surface is roughly 3 miles away. He paused. He was watching her carefully. Most properties of this kind sit unclaimed for years after a death, he said. Sometimes forever. Your grandfather, however, made very specific arrangements. He instructed that the property be transferred to you and only to you upon your 19th birthday. Not 18. 19. He was very particular about that. Addie frowned. Why 19? Pierce did not answer right away. He looked down at the folder, then up again. I do not know, he said. He did not say. He simply asked that the offer be held open for 1 year after your 19th birthday, and that, if you did not appear in that time, the land would revert to the county. He slid the folder across the desk toward her. The back taxes total $10, he said. If you wish to claim the property, that is the only cost. Addie reached into her wallet. Her fingers were not quite steady. She pulled out a worn $10 bill, smoothed it flat against her knee, and placed it on the desk. Pierce looked at the bill for a long moment. Then he looked at her. Are you sure, Miss Thorne? It is all I have, she said. Something in his face changed. The careful, lawyerly composure softened just for a heartbeat into something almost paternal. He nodded once and opened the folder. He guided her through 3 pages of paperwork, showing her where to sign her name. The pen trembled slightly in her hand. When she was done, he closed the folder with a small final motion, and then he reached into a drawer and brought out 2 things. The first was a heavy iron key. Old. Dark with age. It looked like something from 100 years ago. The second was a sealed white envelope. He pushed the key across the desk first, then more slowly the envelope. The key opens the building on the property, he said. As for this, he tapped the envelope with one finger. Your grandfather was very specific. You are not to open it here. You are not to open it on the road. You are to open it only after you have spent 1 full night on the land. Addie stared at him. 1 full night, she repeated. Those were his words. She picked up the envelope. It was light. Just paper inside, she guessed. Her name was written across the front in the same careful, slightly slanted handwriting from the index card. Why? She asked. Pierce did not answer right away. Your grandfather was a thoughtful man, Miss Thorne. Everything he did for a reason. I do not pretend to understand all of his reasons. I have simply done what he asked. She nodded slowly. She tucked the envelope into the inner pocket of her jacket, where it would lie flat against her ribs. She wrapped her hand around the iron key and stood up. At the door, she paused. She turned back. Mr. Pierce. He looked up. How long ago did he die? The old lawyer was quiet for a long moment. Just over a year ago, he said. In the spring. Quietly. He had been ill for some time. Addie's throat went tight. And how long did he know? She asked. That he was sick. Pierce considered her for a long moment. Long enough to plan, he said. He had been preparing for this day for a very long time, Miss Thorne. 12 years, by my count. The words struck her like a hand laid flat against her chest. 12 years. He had only died a year ago. But he had been preparing for 12. She wanted to ask what that meant. She wanted to ask 100 questions. But Pierce's face had closed gently, the way a man's face closes when he has said exactly as much as he believes he is permitted to say. So instead, she simply nodded, said thank you, and stepped out into the hallway. The bell above the front door chimed as she walked back out into the afternoon light. The wind had picked up. Somewhere down the street, a screen door banged twice. Addie stood on the sidewalk for a long moment with the iron key cold against her palm, and she thought, he started preparing for me when I was 7 years old. The map Pierce had given her was simple in theory. 3 miles east on the county road, then a left turn onto an unmarked dirt track called Old Timber Road, then half a mile on foot. In practice, it took her almost 2 hours. By the time she found the turnoff, the afternoon was bleeding into evening, and the light had begun to slant gold and low between the trees. The dirt track was barely a track at all. 2 faint tire ruts, half overgrown with last year's grass, winding back into a stand of tall ponderosa pines. The forest pressed in on either side. The air smelled of cold sap and damp earth. Her boots made soft, careful sounds in the dirt. She had never been alone in a place this large. In the city, even when she was by herself, there were always other people. Footsteps in a hallway. Cars on a street. Voices through a wall. Out here, the silence was different. It was not empty. It was full. Full of wind in pine needles. Full of the distant call of a hawk somewhere overhead. Full of her own breath loud in her own ears. She walked for a long time. Then the trees opened. The clearing came on her all at once. One moment she was pushing through a stand of low brush, and the next she was standing at the edge of a wide, flat opening in the forest. And there, in the middle of it, was the building. Addie stopped. The shape of it was unmistakable. A Quonset hut. Long curve made of corrugated steel arched over a concrete foundation. She had seen pictures of buildings like this before. They had been used during the Second World War for everything from barracks to airplane hangars. After the war, thousands of them had been sold off as surplus, and farmers and homesteaders had hauled them out into the countryside to use as storage barns. They were cheap. They were strong. And they lasted forever even when their owners did not. This one had been here a long time. The metal was streaked orange and brown with rust. The east side had a long horizontal stain where the rain had run down the curve of the roof for decades. A pine sapling had taken root against the north wall, growing up through a crack in the foundation. Tall grass had swallowed the lower edges. 2 small windows on the south side were broken, the glass hanging in jagged shards. A single line of stovepipe rose from the roof, leaning slightly capped with rust. She walked toward it slowly. The front of the building had a pair of large metal doors joined in the middle and chained together with a heavy padlock. The chain was thick. The lock was the size of her fist. She reached into her pocket and brought out the iron key. For a long moment she just stood there, looking at the lock and the key in her hand. They did not match in any obvious way. The key was old, and the lock was newer. and she felt a sudden sharp certainty that this was where it would all fall apart. The key would not fit. The lock would not open. She would have spent her $10 on a building she could not enter. She slid the key into the lock. It went in. She turned it. For a long, awful second, nothing happened. The mechanism resisted. The metal scraped softly inside itself. She turned harder. The key bit. And then with a sudden heavy chunk, the lock gave way. The chain slithered loose and fell against the doors with a dull metallic clang that echoed across the clearing. Addie let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She put both hands against the right-hand door and pulled. The hinges shrieked. The door swung outward in a long, slow arc, and a great breath of cold, stale air rolled out of the dark interior, smelling of dust and old metal, and something faintly like wood smoke from years before. She stepped inside. The building was enormous, much larger than it had looked from the outside. The curved steel ceiling rose high above her, lost in shadow. The concrete floor stretched away into darkness. A single long beam of late afternoon sunlight slanted down through a narrow crack in the roof, cutting through the dust-thick air like a blade of pale gold. She walked into the center of the building into the beam of light, and there, sitting directly in the middle of the floor exactly where the sunlight fell, was a wooden crate. Addie stopped. The crate was old, dark wood banded with iron, rope handles on either side frayed and stiffened with age. It was small enough that a strong man could have carried it, but heavy enough that he would have remembered it for the rest of his life. Sitting on top of the crate, weighted in place by a smooth gray river stone, was a single folded piece of paper. Her name was written on it. Adeline. She knelt slowly on the cold concrete. The light caught the side of her face. She lifted the stone, set it carefully aside, and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was the same as the index card, the same as the envelope in her jacket. Slow, careful, slightly slanted to the right. Addie, if you have come this far, you have already done the hardest part. The rest is easy. Open the crate, read what is inside, and then sleep one night under this roof before you decide anything else. She read it twice. Then she put both hands on the lid of the crate and lifted. The lid came up with a soft, dry sound. Inside, packed in neat rows on a bed of dry yellow straw, were jars. Glass canning jars. The kind her mother had used to make jam when Addie was very small. There were 12 of them, arranged in 3 rows of 4, each one sealed tight with a metal lid. Each one was filled with money. Tightly rolled bundles of paper stacked one on top of another, packed in so tightly they pressed against the curved glass. Through the glass she could see the faded green of $20 bills, the edges slightly worn, banded together with thin brown rubber bands. Addie stopped breathing. For a long moment she simply did not move. The light shifted on the floor beside her as the sun outside slid a little lower behind the trees. Somewhere far away a crow called. A pine cone fell on the metal roof with a soft thwack. None of it reached her. The world had narrowed down to the inside of the crate and the gentle weight of impossible things. She reached in with both hands and lifted out one of the jars. It was heavy, much heavier than she had expected. The glass was cold against her palms. She held it up to the beam of sunlight and turned it slowly. Inside, she could count the bundles. 5. Each bundle held perhaps 50 bills. 5 times, 50 times 20. $5,000 in a single jar. She set the jar down very gently on the concrete beside her. She counted the others without lifting them. 12 jars. If each one held the same, then the crate held $60,000. $60,000. She had been turning 19 with $43 in her pocket that morning. A small broken sound came out of her throat. Not quite a laugh, not quite a cry, something in between. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth and held it there. Her eyes burned. She did not cry. She refused to cry. She had not cried in a very long time, and she was not going to start now kneeling on a cold concrete floor in a rusted metal building in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by more money than she had ever seen in her life. She looked down into the crate again. Beneath where the jars had been arranged, half hidden under the straw, she saw something else. A leather journal, dark brown, worn smooth at the corners. The cover was embossed with 2 faint gold letters almost rubbed away by time. S.T. Silas Thorne. She lifted it out with both hands. The leather was soft the way old leather gets when a hand has held it 1,000 times. She set the journal in her lap and opened it gently. The first page was a letter. Addie, if you are reading this, then you walk the road. I hoped you would walk. I want you to know before anything else that the money in this crate is not a gift. I want you to know that. And I want you to feel the weight of it as you read this. This money is not a gift. It is an apology. An apology for 10 years of silence. She stopped reading. She lowered the journal. She stared down at the open page on her knees, and her vision blurred. And she pressed her hand harder against her mouth, because the word silence had landed inside her chest, like a stone dropped into deep water, and she could feel it sinking down through everything she had ever believed about him. 10 years of silence. He had counted them. He had counted them the same way she had. Outside, the light was fading. The pine trees beyond the open door had gone from green to deep blue. The first stars were beginning to show above the ridge. The temperature was dropping fast. Addie closed the journal slowly and held it against her chest. She did not read any further. Not yet. There was too much in those first few sentences already. Too much to carry into a strange, dark night in a strange, empty building. She placed the journal carefully back into the crate on top of the jars. She slid the lid back on. She stood up. Her legs felt strange beneath her, as if they belonged to someone else. She walked to the open door of the Quonset hut and looked out at the clearing. The sky above the mountains had turned the color of cold steel. The wind moved through the tall grass at the edge of the trees. Somewhere far off an owl called once, and was answered and was silent. She thought, I am 19 years old, and I am alone in the mountains, and there is $60,000 sitting on the floor behind me. And a man I thought did not love me has just told me that he counted the years. She thought, I am going to sleep here tonight. She thought, whatever is in that other envelope, I'm going to read it tomorrow. But the thought lasted only a moment, because as she stood there in the doorway with the cold air on her face and her grandfather's iron key still warm from her hand, She remembered Pierce's voice. Soft, firm, specific. You are to open it only after you have spent one full night on the land. She slid her hand into the inner pocket of her jacket. The white envelope was still there, flat against her ribs, light as paper, heavy as everything. Addie looked up at the darkening sky. She thought one night. He asked for one night. She thought, I have waited 10 years. I can wait one more. She went back inside the building. She closed the heavy metal door behind her. She found in the corner near the entrance a stack of folded canvas tarps that smelled of mildew but were dry enough to lie on. She dragged 2 of them into a rough nest in the center of the floor near the crate, where the last of the daylight from the cracks in the roof made the dust shimmer. She unrolled the thin wool blanket from her backpack. She lay down. The cold rose up out of the concrete beneath her, slow and patient. She pulled her jacket tighter. She put her hand against the side of the crate, the way a child puts a hand against the wall of a room to know that the room is real. The wood was rough and cool under her palm. She closed her eyes. Sleep did not come for a long time. The building creaked softly in the wind. Somewhere in the rafters, something small and quick scurried along a beam. A coyote howled far away on the ridge above the clearing. The sound was answered by another closer, and then by a chorus, and then by silence again. Addie lay still in the dark and listened to her own breathing. She thought about the letter in her jacket. She thought about Pierce's careful voice. She thought about the words on the first page of the journal. This money is not a gift. It is an apology. And just before sleep finally took her, she thought one more thing. And the thought arrived in her grandfather's voice, the way she half remembered it from when she was 9 years old. Slow and careful and patient. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. She slept. Morning came late and gray inside the building. The high, curved roof held the darkness longer than the open sky would have. When Addie woke, she did not know at first where she was. She blinked up at the rusted metal arc above her, and for a long, disoriented moment she thought she was still inside the youth center, in a room she did not recognize. Then the cold from the concrete reached up through the tarp, and the memory of the previous day arrived in one full piece, and she sat up. The crate was still there. The jars were still inside it. None of it had been a dream. She stood up slowly. Her body was stiff. Her shoulders ached. She walked to the heavy metal door and pushed it open, and the morning light spilled into the building in a long, pale wedge across the floor. She stepped outside. The clearing was beautiful. She had not noticed the day before how beautiful it was. The grass was silver with frost. The pine trees beyond the open ground caught the rising sun on their tops lit up gold, while their trunks were still in cool blue shadow. The sky was a clean, washed, pale blue, the kind of blue you only ever saw in the mountains in early spring. The air smelled of cold stone and sap. She breathed it in. She breathed it in deep. And then she remembered the envelope. She slid her hand into the inner pocket of her jacket. It was still there. Flat, light, patient. She sat down on the concrete step in front of the building, the rising sun warm on her face, and she took the envelope out and looked at it. Her name was written across the front in the careful, slanted hand she now knew was her grandfather's, Adeline. She broke the seal. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. The photograph was old, color but faded. The edges were soft the way photographs get when they have been handled often. It showed a man and a child standing in front of the Quonset hut. The hut behind them was newer. The metal was less rusted. The pine sapling on the north wall was not yet there. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy canvas work jacket and a wool cap. His face was weathered, but his smile was easy and wide. In his arms, he held a small child, a girl, maybe 3 years old. The girl was wearing a red coat. She had dark hair tied back in 2 short pigtails, and she was laughing at something just past the edge of the photograph. Her small hand was tangled in the collar of the man's jacket. The man was her grandfather, Silas Thorne, younger than she had ever known him, strong, healthy, happy. The child was her. Addie stared at the photograph for a long time. She did not breathe. She did not move. The sunlight crept slowly across her hands and warmed the paper she was holding. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same careful, slanted handwriting, was a single line. Addie, the day I brought you home for the first time, you were 3 years old. You will not remember, but I do. She read it once. She read it again. She read it a third time because the words refused to settle. She had been here before, 16 years ago, before her mother got sick, before her father vanished, before the youth center and the bunk beds and the bleach-smelling cafeterias and the 10 years of silence her grandfather had carried her in his arms through this clearing and stood in front of this building and let someone take their picture. She had been here. She had been loved here. And she did not remember any of it. Addie sat on the cold concrete step with the photograph in her hands and the rising sun on her face. And for the first time since she had walked out of the youth center the morning before, she understood with a sudden and total clarity that nothing about her life was what she had believed it to be. This place was not unfamiliar. This place was a memory she had lost, and whatever else her grandfather had hidden out here on this strange forgotten piece of land that no one had wanted for $10. It was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one she had never been told. Addie sat on the cold concrete step for a long time after she finished reading the back of the photograph. The sun climbed higher. The frost on the grass began to melt in slow patches, leaving the clearing wet and dark in some places and still silver in others. A pair of small brown birds chased each other through the lower branches of a pine at the edge of the clearing. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking faint and far away, the only human sound for miles. She did not move. She held the photograph in both hands, balanced carefully on her knees as if it were made of glass instead of paper. She looked at the man in the heavy canvas jacket. She looked at the small girl in the red coat. She tried to reach back into her own memory for some scrap of this moment. The smell of his jacket, the sound of his voice, the feel of his arm under her legs. Anything. There was nothing. The girl in the photograph was a stranger to her. So was the man. And yet they were both her own blood. She had been here. She had been loved here. And she did not remember. A small, sharp pain moved through her chest. Not grief exactly, something older. The grief of a thing she had not known she had lost. She placed the photograph carefully back inside the white envelope and the envelope back inside the inner pocket of her jacket against her ribs where it would lie warm and flat all day. Then she stood up and she went back into the building. The crate was still there. The jars were still inside. The journal was still on top. Addie walked past them. She did not open the journal yet. She was not ready. Whatever was written in those pages was the explanation for the photograph and the explanation for the 10 years of silence, and she could feel without reading a single word that the truth was going to ask something of her she did not yet know how to give. So she did something else instead. She went to work. She did not know in that moment that she was making a decision. She thought she was just keeping her hands busy, but looking back later, she would understand that this was the moment she chose. The moment she stopped being a girl who had walked out of a building with $43 and became a girl who had walked into a building she meant to keep. She started with the door. The hinges were rusted nearly solid. They had shrieked when she opened the door the day before, and she did not want to listen to that sound every time she came and went. She walked back outside around the building and into the tall grass near the north wall. She had noticed the evening before an old metal toolbox half buried in the weeds, its lid bent and orange with rust. She crouched and pried it open. Inside, miraculously, was a small can of 3-in-1 oil, the label faded almost to white. She shook it. There was still liquid inside. She carried the can back to the front door, knelt down, and worked the oil patiently into the top hinge, then the bottom one. She moved the door back and forth. The shriek became a groan. The groan became a creak. The creak became finally a soft, dry sigh. She stood back and looked at the door. It was a small thing. A door that opened quietly was such a small thing. But standing there in the morning sun with the smell of oil on her hands and her breath visible in the cold air, she felt for the first time in a long time that she had made something a little better than it had been when she found it. She would remember that feeling. She would chase it the rest of the day. By noon, she had cleared the tall grass away from the front of the building with her bare hands and a rusted bow saw she had found leaning in a corner inside. She had hauled the fallen pine sapling away from the north wall. She had stacked an armful of dry sticks for kindling beside the cold cast-iron stove she had discovered against the back wall, half hidden behind a stack of empty wooden crates. She had drunk the last of the water she had brought from town and was beginning to understand that she would have to walk to the small stream she could hear somewhere down the slope behind the building before the afternoon was out. She also understood more practically that she was going to need help. Not much. Not from many people. She did not want crowds. She did not want curiosity. But she could not put a roof patch on by herself. And she could not run a stovepipe by herself. And she did not know the first thing about water lines. She thought about the hardware store on the main street of Pine Hollow. Whitlock's, the hand-painted sign had read. She slung her backpack over one shoulder. She locked the front doors of the Quonset hut behind her with the iron key. She put the key on a length of twine she had cut from a roll she had found inside, and she hung it around her neck under her shirt, where it would lie flat against her collarbone and never leave her body. Then She walked the 3 miles back into town. The hardware store smelled of sawdust and machine oil, and the dry, sharp smell of new rope. A bell chimed softly above the door as Addie pushed her way inside. The shelves rose high on either side of her. Boxes of nails, coils of copper wire, hammers and saws and chisels hanging from pegboard hooks. The light through the front windows was yellow and slow. A small wood stove burned quietly in the back corner, and the air near it shimmered faintly. Behind the counter at the rear of the store stood an old man. He was perhaps 70, tall and lean. His hair was white and cropped close to his skull. His face was weathered. The skin at the corners of his eyes folded into deep, calm lines. He was wearing a flannel shirt, the color of dark green pine, and his hands resting flat on the wooden counter were the hands of a man who had used them for a very long time. He looked up as the bell chimed. His eyes went to her face. They stayed there. For a moment he did not move. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and Addie had the unmistakable feeling that he had been waiting for her to walk through that door. Perhaps for a long time. Perhaps for years. Then he straightened slowly. "Morning," he said. His voice was deep and careful, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. "Morning," Addie said. He waited. "I am looking for some things," she said. "I am fixing up a place." "What kind of place?" She hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Then she said, "A building, out past Old Timber Road." The old man did not move. He did not even blink, but something in his face shifted. Not surprise, recognition. The same recognition she had seen in Holden Pierce's face the day before. The face of a man for whom a long-expected door has finally opened. That would be the Thorne property, he said quietly. Addie's hand went before she could stop it to the twine around her neck, to the shape of the iron key beneath her shirt. "You knew him," she said. The old man looked at her for a long moment. "My name is Bram Whitlock," he said. "And yes, I knew Silas Thorne. I knew him for almost 50 years. He came out from behind the counter. He did not rush. He moved the way old men in mountain towns move, deliberately conserving everything. He stopped a few feet from her and looked her up and down, once taking in the worn boots, the thin jacket, the backpack that was almost as big as she was. "You will be needing a list," he said. It was not a question. He fetched a small spiral notebook and the stub of a carpenter's pencil from behind the counter. He flipped the notebook open to a clean page. "Tell me what you have already," he said, "and I will tell you what you do not." Addie told him. She told him about the door and the oil and the stove she had not yet lit. She told him about the broken windows on the south side. She told him about the crack in the roof and the cold rising up through the concrete at night. She told him about the stream she could hear but had not yet walked to. Bram Whitlock wrote nothing down for a long time. He simply listened. When she was finished, he gave a small, slow nod, and then he wrote in handwriting that was very neat and very square. A list of about 20 items. A roll of heavy roofing tar, a bundle of cedar shingles, a length of stovepipe, a new chimney cap, a box of 3-inch screws, a pry bar, a claw hammer with a fiberglass handle, a length of 1-inch PVC, a spool of baling wire, 2 replacement window panes pre-cut to 12 by 16 inches, a small can of glazing putty, a pair of leather work gloves in a size that would fit her hands. He tore the page out, folded it once, and handed it to her. "That will get you through the first week," he said. She looked down at the list, then up at him. "How much?" she asked. His eyes did not move from her face. "Whatever you can pay today," he said. "You can come back for the rest." Addie's throat went tight. "I can pay," she said, and her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. "I can pay all of it." He studied her for another long moment. Something gentle moved across his face, not pity. Something more careful than pity. "All right then," he said. "Let us get you set up." She paid him in $20 bills from one of the jars. She had stopped at the edge of the clearing on her way down the mountain and counted out $300 and tucked the bundle inside the bottom of her backpack beneath a folded shirt. When she laid the bills out on the counter, Bram Whitlock looked at them only briefly. He did not ask where they had come from. He did not raise an eyebrow. He simply counted them out with the careful steadiness of a man who had counted $20 bills on that same counter for 50 years. And he made her change in coins from a small wooden drawer. Then he helped her load the heavier items into a battered red wheelbarrow he kept behind the store. He told her she could borrow it for as long as she needed it. He showed her how to balance the load so it would not tip on the rougher sections of road. And then, just as she turned to leave, he said one more thing. "Miss Thorne." She looked back. "Your grandfather," he said. "He was a good man." His voice was very even. A better man than most people in this town ever knew. Addie stood there in the doorway of the hardware store with the wheelbarrow heavy in front of her, and the cold afternoon light slanting in through the front windows, and she opened her mouth to ask him what he meant. But Bram Whitlock had already turned away. He was bent over the wood stove in the back corner, adding a small split log to the fire, his back broad and patient under the green flannel. He did not look up again. She pushed the wheelbarrow out into the street. She walked the 3 miles back to the clearing as the afternoon light began to fade. 3 days passed. They were the hardest 3 days Addie had ever worked in her life. She had blisters on both palms by the end of the first morning. By the second day, the blisters had broken and bled into her gloves. By the third day, her hands had begun in the small and patient way that hands do to harden into something rougher and more useful than they had been before. She patched the crack in the roof with a square of heavy tar paper and a sheet of corrugated tin. She scavenged from a collapsed lean-to behind the building. She replaced the 2 broken windows on the south side with the pre-cut panes from Whitlock's, working the glazing putty into the frames with her thumb, the way she had watched a janitor do it once at the youth center years ago. She fed the cast-iron stove a careful first fire of dry pine needles and small split kindling. And when the chimney drew clean and the warmth began to spread through the building for the first time in 20 years, she sat down on a wooden crate and watched the small flames behind the glass door and did not move for a long time. She also, on the second night, finally opened the journal again. She had been putting it off. She knew that. The first page had cut too deep, and she had needed time and work and the simple animal exhaustion of a body pushed past its limits before she could let those careful, slanted words back into her chest. But on the second night after the stove had burned down to coals, and the air inside the building had grown soft and warm. She sat on her bedroll with her grandfather's leather journal open across her knees, and she read. She read for 3 hours. She read until the coals had gone gray and the cold had crept back into the corners of the building. She read until she understood. Silas Thorne had not been a man who hid from the world for no reason. He had been a builder, a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands. He had grown up in a small Colorado town not far from Pine Hollow, the son of a stonemason. He had come of age in the late 1960s, and he had married Addie's grandmother, a woman named Marion, when he was 23, and she was 21. They had moved to Denver because that was where the work was. And there in Denver in the spring of 1973, when Addie's father was 4 years old, Silas had taken a job as a foreman with a fast-growing construction firm called Vance and Halverson Construction. For 5 years, the work was good. And then in 1978, he was assigned to a project that would change his life and end his wife's. The project was an elementary school in a small suburb outside Denver. It was a city contract, public money, strict specifications. Vance and Halverson had won the bid by submitting the lowest number. Silas had been put in charge of the framing crew. In the journal, his handwriting on these pages was tighter than on the others. The letters were smaller. The lines were closer together. Addie had to lean closer to the small kerosene lamp she had bought at the hardware store to read them. He wrote about the lumber. The lumber that had been delivered to the site was not the lumber that had been specified in the contract. The grade was wrong. The dimensions were close but not exact. The moisture content was too high. He had said so to the site superintendent. The site superintendent had told him to use it anyway. He had said so to the project manager. The project manager had told him not to worry about it. He had said so finally in writing in a memo addressed to the owners of the company, 2 men named Cyrus Vance and Earl Halverson. He had received no reply. 3 weeks later, he had been quietly reassigned to a smaller project on the other side of the city. The elementary school had been completed in the summer of 1979. In the winter of 1981, after 2 years of wait and weather, and the slow, patient settling of an undersized roof on undersized beams, a section of the gymnasium ceiling had given way during a school assembly. The collapse had been small, only one corner. The structural failure had been partial, and a load-bearing wall had caught most of the falling debris. But 2 children had been hurt. A boy of 8 and a girl of 9, both struck by falling tiles. Neither had died. Both had been hospitalized. The boy had recovered fully within a year. The girl had walked with a slight limp for the rest of her life. Silas Thorne had read about the collapse in the morning paper. He had set the paper down. He had stood up. He had walked to the back of the small house in the Denver suburbs where he and Marion and their son lived, and he had stood in the doorway of the kitchen where his wife was making coffee, and he had said to her very quietly, "I cannot keep this inside me." Marion had set the coffee pot down. She had said, "Then you will not." In the journal on this page, Silas had written, "She did not even pause. She did not even consider it. She simply looked at me and she said what she said. And I knew that whatever came next, we were going to face it together." Addie had to stop reading for a while after that. She set the journal down across her knees and she stared at the small flames behind the door of the stove. And she thought about her grandmother, a woman she had never known, a woman who had died years before Addie was born, a woman whose first instinct when her husband told her he was about to walk into a fight with two powerful men was to tell him without hesitation that he was right. Addie had not known where she came from until that moment. She had not known. She picked the journal back up. Silas had begun to gather his evidence quietly. He had copies of the original specifications. He had the memo he had written to Vance and Halverson. He had statements from two members of his old framing crew, who had also seen the substandard lumber arrive on site. He had photographs he had taken himself with a small camera on the last day he had worked on the project. He had been preparing over the course of several careful months to take everything to the city attorney. He had been 3 weeks away from his appointment. Then, on a clear, cold evening in February of 1982, Marion Thorne had driven into Denver to pick up Addie's father from a friend's house. The boy had been 12 years old. The drive home took her along a 2-lane road that wound up into the hills west of the city. There had been no other cars reported in the area. There had been no ice on the road. There had been no mechanical failure found in the wreckage. The police report concluded that she had simply lost control of her vehicle on a curve, struck a tree, and died on impact. Their son, who had been buckled into the passenger seat, had been thrown clear of the car and survived with a broken arm and a concussion. The police had called it an accident. Silas had not. In the journal, his handwriting on this page was so steady that Addie understood somehow that he had written these words not in the days after his wife's death, but years later after the rawness had been worn down by time into something harder and quieter. He wrote, "I cannot prove what happened to Marion. I have never been able to prove it. But I knew the moment the officer came to our door exactly what it was. And I knew in that same moment what I had to do next. What he had done next was disappear. He had taken his son. He had taken the evidence he had gathered. He had withdrawn every dollar he had from his bank account, sold the small house in Denver to a friend for cash, and driven west into the mountains. He had bought, with the help of a lawyer he trusted, an unremarkable parcel of land outside a small mountain town called Pine Hollow. He had hauled an old surplus Quonset hut onto it. He had built a quiet, careful life inside the curved metal walls, and he had raised his son alone, far from the city, far from the men who had killed his wife. He had never spoken his evidence aloud. He had hidden it instead, and he had waited. Addie turned the page. The next page was the first page of an entry written many years later. The handwriting was older now, slightly less steady. The letters slightly larger. The entry was dated in his careful, slanted hand, April 2007. She read, "My son does not forgive me. He has never forgiven me. He believes that I killed his mother by making the decision I made. He does not understand that I made no decision. The decision was made for us the day I read that newspaper. The decision was made the moment Marion set down the coffee pot. I have tried to tell him this. I have tried for 25 years. He cannot hear it. Today he had a daughter. He has told me I am not to come. I will respect that. I will respect his wishes for as long as I can. But the girl who has been given my mother's name will not be safe in the world unless someone watches the door behind her. I cannot be in her life, so I will guard the doorway instead. I will guard it from a distance, and she will never know." Addie read those words. She read them again. She lowered the journal slowly to her knees. The kerosene lamp guttered for a moment, the flame flattening against the glass and then standing back up. Her father had cut him off. Her grandfather had not abandoned her. Her father had taken him away from her. Her grandfather had spent the rest of his life standing at a doorway she had not known existed, watching for trouble she had not known was coming, refusing to come closer because he had made a promise to the son who had never been able to forgive him. The 10 years of silence had been a vow. Addie sat there in the warm glow of the cast-iron stove in the curved belly of the rusted metal building that her grandfather had hauled up into these mountains 43 years before, and she put both her hands flat against the open pages of the journal, and she lowered her forehead onto her hands, and she stayed there for a long time, without moving. She did not cry. She had not cried yet. She did not know if she still remembered how. But something inside her chest, some old and crooked thing that had been holding itself in a wrong position for 10 years, began very slowly to settle into a position that was less wrong. He had loved her. He had loved her the whole time. He had simply not been allowed to say so. The next morning, Roland Vance came to the clearing. Addie was outside splitting kindling on a stump near the front of the building when she heard the sound of an engine. It was the wrong kind of sound for the road. The trucks she had heard pass on the county highway in the last 3 days had all been older, working trucks. This engine was newer, smoother, the hum of an expensive vehicle climbing a road it had not been designed for. She set the hatchet down. A black SUV came up out of the trees and into the clearing, and stopped about 30 feet from the building. The morning sun caught its windshield and threw a flat, hard reflection across the grass. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was perhaps 50. He was dressed in clean dark jeans and a charcoal wool jacket that had not been bought in any store within 100 miles of Pine Hollow. His hair was steel gray and cut close. His shoes were leather and polished. He stood beside the open door of the SUV and looked across the clearing at her, and his face arranged itself into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Thorne," he said. His voice carried easily across the clearing. "I am Roland Vance. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." Addie did not move. She did not answer. He took the silence as permission. He closed the door of the SUV and walked toward her across the grass. He moved the way men in expensive shoes move across uneven ground, lightly picking his footing. He stopped about 10 feet from her. He did not offer his hand. "I represent a private investment group," he said. "We have been monitoring properties of this type for some time. Your situation came to our attention through the county records last week. I will not waste your time. I am authorized to offer you $80,000 in cash for this parcel. Today, the paperwork can be drawn up before sundown. $80,000. Addie heard the number. She heard it land. She felt somewhere very far underneath her sternum the cold, practical weight of what $80,000 meant for a girl who had walked out of a youth center 4 days earlier with 43. She looked at Roland Vance. She looked at his shoes. She looked at the smile that did not reach his eyes. She thought, "You said your name too easily." She thought, "You said it the way a man says a name he is used to saying, the way a man says a name he has never had to hide." "No," Addie said. The word came out steady. Roland Vance's smile did not change. "I understand the property has sentimental value to you," he said. "I am told your grandfather owned it for many years. We are prepared to take that into consideration. The offer can be adjusted. Within reason." "No," Addie said again. This time his smile thinned. Just slightly. Just at the corners. "Miss Thorne, may I be candid? You may leave." The silence that followed her words was the longest silence she had ever stood inside. Roland Vance looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. It was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. It was the cold, careful calculation of a man who had not been told no in a very long time, and who was deciding in real time which of several available responses would best serve his next move. He chose patience. He inclined his head just slightly. "Of course," he said. "Forgive me. I will leave my card. Should you reconsider, the offer will stand for 72 hours. He reached into the inner pocket of his wool jacket and produced a small white business card. He held it out. Addie did not move to take it. After a moment, he stepped forward and laid it carefully on the top of the splitting stump beside her hatchet. He stepped back. "Good day, Miss Thorne." He walked back to the SUV. He got in. He turned the vehicle around in a wide, slow arc and drove back down the dirt track and out of sight beneath the pines. Addie did not move until the sound of the engine had faded completely. Then she walked over to the splitting stump and picked up the card. The card was thick and cream-colored, the kind of card that cost $1 to print and was meant to feel like it had cost 20. Embossed in clean, dark letters, it read, "Roland Vance, Principal Vance, Legacy Holdings, LLC, Denver, Colorado, Vance." Addie stood very still in the morning sun, with the card between her fingers, and the cold weight of her grandfather's iron key against her collarbone. And she thought about the name in the journal. Cyrus Vance, co-founder of Vance and Halverson Construction. The man who had ordered the substandard lumber. The man who, in her grandfather's careful, slanted handwriting, had been named alongside Earl Halverson on the memo that had received no reply. This man was not a stranger. This man was a grandson. Addie folded the card in half. She folded it in half again. She slid it into her back pocket. She picked up the hatchet, and she went back to splitting kindling, and she split it for an hour without stopping until her shoulders ached and her hands shook, because her body needed somewhere to put the cold, clean fury that had risen up inside her chest. He had come for the evidence. He had not come for the land. That night after dark, someone walked through the tall grass behind the building. Addie was awake. The stove was burning low. She had been lying on her bedroll reading the journal again by lamplight, the same pages she had read the night before, trying to fit the new shape of Roland Vance into the older shape of Cyrus Vance, and seeing how the edges matched. She heard the footstep through the open south window where she had cracked the new pane an inch for air. It was a small sound, the dry crackle of last year's grass under a boot. She did not move. She turned the wick of the lamp down to almost nothing. She lay still in the half-dark and listened. A second footstep, then a third. Someone was walking along the back wall of the building slowly in the direction of the small lean-to where she had stacked her tools. The footsteps stopped. There was a quiet metallic sound. Someone was lifting the corner of the tarp she had thrown over the woodpile. Addie reached very slowly for the hatchet she had set down beside her bedroll. She did not call out. She waited. The footsteps moved again, slower this time, around the east side of the building, toward the front door. She rose up off the bedroll without a sound. She was barefoot. She crossed the concrete floor on the balls of her feet. She stopped 6 feet from the inside of the front door, in the deep shadow beside the stove, with the hatchet in her right hand and the lamp dark behind her. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door. For a long moment there was nothing. Then a single soft sound. A hand, testing the door, trying the handle. The handle did not turn. She had bolted it from the inside the way her grandfather had bolted it 40 years before her with a heavy iron slide bolt set deep into the steel frame. There was a small pause. Then the footsteps moved away. Around the building. Back into the grass. Down the slope. Gone. Addie did not move for almost an hour. When she finally relit the lamp, her hands were steady. She walked to the front door and stood with her palm flat against the cold steel. On the other side of that door, less than 5 feet from where she was standing now, a man had stood and tried her handle in the dark. She thought about the card in her back pocket. She thought about Roland Vance's polished shoes. She thought, you did not come yourself. You sent someone. She thought, you will come yourself eventually, but you sent someone first. In the morning, she walked back into town. She did not go to the hardware store first. She walked past it 3 more blocks to a small public library housed inside what had once been a Methodist church. The librarian was a thin, gray-haired woman in a cardigan who looked up over her glasses and said, in a voice that was kind without being warm, that yes, the back room had a microfilm reader, and yes, they kept the Denver papers back to 1960, and yes, she could show Addie how to use it. Addie spent 4 hours in that back room. She read every article she could find about the gymnasium collapse at the elementary school in the suburb outside Denver in the winter of 1981. She read every article she could find about Vance and Halverson Construction, which had quietly folded in 1986 after a string of unrelated bankruptcies. She read, finally, in a small back-section article from a Denver business journal, dated 2 years earlier, that one Roland Vance, grandson of the late Cyrus Vance, had recently founded a private holdings company specializing in the recovery of distressed real estate assets across the Front Range region of Colorado. She wrote nothing down. She did not need to. When she walked out of the library into the bright, cold afternoon, she went directly to the hardware store. The bell chimed above the door. The wood stove was burning in the back corner. Bram Whitlock was standing behind the counter, exactly where he had been the first time she had walked through that door, as if he had not moved in 3 days. He looked up as she came in. He looked at her face. He read it the way he had read her list, quietly, carefully. without surprise. He said nothing. Addie walked all the way down the length of the store. She stopped in front of the counter. She set her hands flat on the worn wood between them. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, "I think you and my grandfather were more than acquaintances." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached slowly under the counter and brought out a small iron key on a worn leather thong. He laid it on the wood between her hands. The key was nearly identical to the one around her neck, slightly smaller, slightly darker. The same maker, the same hand. "Silas gave me this 12 years ago," Bram Whitlock said quietly. "He told me to hold it until you came looking for the truth. He said you would come looking eventually. He said when you did, I would know." Addie did not pick up the key. She looked at him. "Where does it go?" she asked. The old man's face was very still. "I do not know," he said. "He never told me. He said you would have to find that out yourself." He paused. His voice softened. "He said, Bram, when she comes through your door asking real questions, you give her the key, and then you get out of her way. She has to do the rest alone." That was what he said. Those were his words. Addie reached out very slowly, and she lifted the key off the counter. It was warm from his hand. She closed her fingers around it. Outside, the wind was rising in the pines, and somewhere far up the slope in the clearing where the rusted Quonset hut waited in the long afternoon light, the small, dark shape of everything her grandfather had hidden in the world was waiting for her to come home and find it. Addie walked back to the clearing with the second iron key warm in her closed fist. She did not stop along the way. She did not look at the trees. She walked the 3 miles up the dirt track at a pace that left her breathing hard by the time the pines opened into the clearing. And when she stepped into the open ground in front of the rusted Quonset hut, the late afternoon sun was already slanting low across the metal roof, turning the whole curved surface the color of copper. She crossed the grass to the front doors. She unlocked them with the first key, the one around her neck, the one her grandfather had left with the lawyer. She pushed the right-hand door open. It did not shriek anymore. It sighed the way she had taught it to. She walked inside and stood in the center of the building in the long, pale shaft of sunlight that fell through the patch seam in the roof. And she opened her hand and looked at the second key in her palm. It was smaller than the first, slightly darker. The teeth were finer. It was the kind of key that opened something inside another thing. A box, a drawer, a panel set into a wall. She turned slowly where she stood. The Quonset hut around her was a single, long, curved chamber. Concrete floor, curved steel walls, the cast iron stove in the back, the crate against the south wall, her bedroll, her tools, the patch south windows. There was nowhere obvious for a hidden lock to be. There was no second room. There was no basement door. There was no panel in any wall that she could see. She walked the perimeter of the building slowly, her left hand trailing along the curved steel. She did not find anything. She walked the perimeter a second time closer to the wall, her fingers searching for the seam of any hidden hatch. She did not find anything. She crouched at the back of the building and tapped along the line where the steel met the concrete with the handle of a screwdriver. The sound was the same all the way along, solid. hollow only where she expected it to be hollow. She stood up. The light from the patch seam had shifted across the floor. The sun was getting lower. She thought about the journal. She thought about the sketches inside it. She walked to her bedroll, sat down cross-legged, and pulled the journal into her lap. She had read most of the journal twice. She had read the front pages, the long, careful account of Vance and Halverson and the elementary school and her grandmother. She had read the middle pages, the years of patient observation. The small entries about her father and her childhood, all written from a distance, all written from behind a door. Her grandfather had refused to open. She had read the late pages, the entries from his last few years, the slow and grateful entries of a man who knew his time was ending and who had made his peace with how he had spent it. She had skipped in all her reading the technical pages. There were dozens of them. Sketches, floor plans, measurements, lists of materials. She had assumed they were the working notes of a builder. The kind of pages a man like her grandfather would have kept all his life out of habit. She had glanced at them and turned past them, looking for the words. Now she opened the journal to the first sketch. It was a floor plan of the Quonset hut. She had not realized the first time she saw it. She had thought it was a generic drawing, a practice sketch. Now, with the building around her, and the light falling exactly where it always fell, she recognized every line, the shape of the front doors, the position of the stove against the back wall, the two small windows on the south side, the single high vent in the curve of the roof. It was this building, drawn by the man who had hauled it onto this land and lived inside it. And along the bottom edge of the floor plan, written in his careful, slanted hand, was a single line of numbers, 47 inches from the northeast corner. Addie stared at the line for a long moment. She turned the page. The next sketch was a side view of the same building drawn in cross-section. The roof, the walls, the floor. And below the floor, in a small dotted rectangle that she had taken before to be a foundation detail, was a shape she had not understood. A small enclosed space, tucked under the concrete, beneath the northeast corner of the building. She looked again at the number, 47 inches from the northeast corner. She looked again at the dotted rectangle. She closed the journal. She stood up slowly. She walked to the northeast corner of the building where the curved steel wall met the concrete floor, and she crouched down. She set her palm flat against the concrete. It was cold. It was solid. It was the same gray slab that ran all the way through the building. There was no seam she could see. There was no edge. There was no hint of anything beneath it. She drew a deep breath. Then she measured. She did not have a tape measure of the right length on her, so she used her own forearm. From wrist to elbow, she knew was almost exactly 10 inches. She had measured it once at the youth center for a sewing project. She walked her forearms along the floor from the corner. 1, 2, 3, 4, almost 5, 47 inches. She marked the spot with the tip of the second key. She sat back on her heels and looked at the place she had marked. It looked like nothing. It looked like more concrete. She got up. She walked to the corner of the building where her tools were stacked. She picked up the small sledgehammer she had bought from Bram Whitlock that first day, and she picked up the heavy iron pry bar, and she carried them back to the mark on the floor. She stood over the spot for a long moment. This was the building. This was the floor. This was the work of the man who had hauled this steel up into these mountains 43 years ago. To break the floor was to break something he had made. She could feel the wrongness of it in her chest. But she could feel something else, too. She could feel him standing somewhere just behind her left shoulder. The way she had felt him in the photograph, the way she had felt him in every page of the journal. And she understood that he had drawn the dotted rectangle and written the number for exactly this moment. He had built the floor and then drawn the map and then waited. She lifted the sledgehammer. She brought it down. The first blow rang through the building like a bell. The concrete cracked white in a small star around the point of impact. The second blow widened the star. The third blow opened it into a small ragged hole. On the fourth blow, the sledge punched through, and the head of the hammer dropped 2 inches into empty air on the far side. Addie set the sledge down. She got down on her knees. She worked the pry bar into the hole and levered up. A flat slab of concrete the size of a dinner plate came loose. She lifted it out and set it aside. She worked the pry bar in again. A second slab came loose. She set it aside too. She kept working, slab after slab. Her shoulders burned. Sweat ran into her eyes. The light from the patched roof seam moved slowly across the floor as the sun went down. The hole opened wider. 18 inches, 2 feet, 2.5 feet. She stopped. She picked up the kerosene lamp from beside her bedroll. She lit the wick. She held the lamp out over the hole and looked down. Beneath the broken concrete was a small wooden chamber. It was not large, perhaps 3 feet square and 2 feet deep. The walls of the chamber were lined with old pine boards, fitted carefully together. The wood gone dark with age, but still sound. The chamber was dry. There was no smell of damp. Whoever had built this had built it to last. Sitting in the chamber on a single folded square of oiled canvas were 2 things. The first was a flat metal strongbox, olive green, military surplus. The kind a man might have brought home from the army in the 1960s and used for the rest of his life to keep important papers in. The hinges were dark with age. The clasp on the front was a simple keyhole. The second was a thick black plastic case the size of a hardcover book. A small white label on the front of the case. In her grandfather's careful slanted hand read, "For Addie. 18 birthday." Addie lowered the lamp. For a long moment she did not move. Then she reached down into the chamber with both hands. She lifted out the strongbox first. It was heavier than she had expected. She set it on the concrete beside her. She reached down again and lifted out the black plastic case. It was lighter. She set it beside the strongbox. She drew the small iron key Bram Whitlock had given her out of her pocket. She held it up to the lamplight. She lowered it to the keyhole on the front of the strongbox. The key slid in. She turned it. The clasp gave way with a small, soft click that was almost gentle. She lifted the lid. Inside the strongbox, packed flat against the green metal, was a thick folder of papers. The top page was a typed letter on the letterhead of a small Denver law office. The date on the letter was 1982. The body of the letter was a sworn statement from a man named Henry Pierce, attorney at law, attesting that on a specified date he had received from one Silas Eldon Thorne a set of documents related to the construction of an elementary school in a named suburb of Denver. and that he had been instructed to preserve those documents in trust until such time as their owner directed otherwise. Henry Pierce. 43 years ago, when Henry Pierce had been a younger man with a younger practice, her grandfather had walked into his office and handed him this folder and told him to keep it safe. Under the letter were the documents themselves, specifications, original architectural drawings, memos. The carbon copy of the memo Silas Thorne had written to Cyrus Vance and Earl Halverson in the summer of 1978, telling them that the lumber being delivered to the site was not the lumber that had been specified. 2 signed statements from members of his old framing crew, a small stack of photographs taken on site, newspaper clippings about the collapse, and at the very bottom of the folder, a single sealed envelope. The envelope was addressed in her grandfather's handwriting to the district attorney of the city and county of Denver. It had never been mailed. Addie understood, looking at it, why. He had not mailed it because to mail it was to draw fire onto his son, to draw fire onto the boy who had survived the wreck on the 2-lane road in February of 1982. He had built a wall of silence around his family instead, and he had kept the wall standing for the rest of his life. He had left the envelope unsealed because he had not been able to send it, and he had left it for her, because she was not his son. She was his granddaughter, and she had walked on her own 2 feet into the clearing. Addie closed the strongbox slowly. She did not lock it. She set the small iron key beside it on the concrete. She turned to the black plastic case. She opened it, and inside, cradled in foam padding, was a single VHS videotape. The white label on the spine of the tape in her grandfather's careful, slanted hand read, "For Addie, 18th birthday." She lifted the tape out of the foam. She held it in both hands. She did not have a way to play it. There was no electricity in the building. There was no television. The Quonset hut had no power lines running to it at all. Whatever was on this tape, she could not see it tonight, but she could see it tomorrow. The pawn shop on the main street of Pine Hollow had a row of old VCRs in the back, gathering dust. She had walked past them on her way to the hardware store the first day. Tomorrow she would carry the tape into town. Tonight she would not. She slid the tape carefully back into the foam padding. She closed the black plastic case. She stood up. Her legs ached. The light from the patched roof seam was almost gone now. The clearing outside had begun to go blue. She walked to the front doors of the Quonset hut. She slid the heavy iron bolt across. She walked back to the broken section of floor. She gathered the strongbox and the black plastic case in her arms. She set them on her bedroll side by side where she could see them. She fed the cast iron stove a careful armful of dry pine. She lit the lamp on the crate beside her bedroll. Then she sat down with her back against the curved steel wall. And she waited. She did not have to wait long. The sound of the engine reached her about an hour after full dark. It was not the same engine. The first time Roland Vance had come, he had come in his expensive black SUV, the engine smooth and quiet. The engine that came up the dirt track tonight was older, rougher. The kind of engine that belonged to a working pickup. There was a second vehicle behind it. She could hear the difference. 2 engines. Slowing. Stopping. Stopping at the edge of the clearing where the trees broke. Doors opening. Doors closing. Voices. 3 voices, low, male, far enough away that she could not make out words. Addie did not move from her place against the curved steel wall. She had not lit the kerosene lamp brightly enough to be visible through the patched south windows. The stove was burning low. From outside, the Quonset hut would look dark. The voices moved. They came across the grass slowly. They were not bothering with quiet. They did not think there was anyone inside who could stop them. Then she smelled it, the smell of gasoline. It came through the cracked south window, faint at first, then stronger. They were carrying cans. They were walking around the building. They were sloshing the gasoline against the curved steel walls. The wet sound of it on the metal was unmistakable. They were going to burn the building. They were going to burn the building with whatever was inside it. Addie's hand went very slowly to the small flat shape of her phone in the inner pocket of her jacket. She had bought a cheap pay-as-you-go phone at the general store on her second day in Pine Hollow. She had topped it up with $20 of minutes. It had no signal at the clearing. She had walked it to the ridge above the building twice in the last 3 days to check. The signal lived at the top of the ridge, not down here. But she had not needed signal tonight because she had made her call from the ridge that afternoon on her way back from the library and the hardware store after she had spent for hours reading about Vance and Halverson construction, and 1 minute looking at the polished shoes of Roland Vance. She had called the Pine Hollow County Sheriff's Office. She had spoken to a deputy named Brennan. She had told him her name. She had told him she had inherited a property out past Old Timber Road. She had told him that a man named Roland Vance had visited her 2 days earlier and offered her $80,000 for the parcel. She had told him she had refused. She had told him that the night after that visit, someone had walked through her clearing in the dark and tried her front door. She had told him she believed they would return. Probably at night. Probably soon. She had told him that if any patrol car was passing the county road near Old Timber tonight, she would feel a great deal safer if they were within radio distance. Deputy Brennan had been quiet for a long moment. He had then said very evenly, "Miss Thorne, you call me directly if anything changes." He had given her his personal number. He had said, "We will have a car on the county road tonight from 10 p.m. onward. You are not alone out there." Now with the smell of gasoline coming through the south window, Addie thought, "I am not alone." She thought, "He believed me." She also thought, "I cannot wait for them." A patrol car on the county road was 3 miles away. 3 miles by road. Faster by radio if the deputies could get to her, but still not fast enough to stop a match. She had to slow them down herself. She thought about the layout of the building. She thought about the doors. The Quonset hut had 2 doors. The big front doors which she had bolted from the inside, and a smaller side door set into the curved steel near the back, which her grandfather had used for hauling firewood. The side door opened outward into a small open lean-to that he had built against the building decades ago to keep his wood dry. The lean-to was enclosed on 3 sides by the building itself and by 2 old wooden walls, and it had its own outer door also opening outward into the grass. If the men outside opened the outer door of the lean-to and stepped inside the lean-to, and then opened the side door to throw gasoline into the building itself, she could trap them inside the lean-to. The outer door of the lean-to swung outward. If she could get behind them and close it, and brace it from the outside, they would be inside a wooden box with a door. They could not pull open against her weight, and the only way out would be to break through the wood, which would take them long enough for the deputies to get up the road. She would not be inside the building when they came in. She would be outside it. Addie moved. She rolled silently off the bedroll. She picked up the strongbox and the black plastic case and the journal, and she carried them in her arms to the front doors. She unbolted the front doors. She slipped outside into the cold night. She closed the doors behind her. She did not lock them. If the men got past the lean-to plan, she did not want them trapped in the building with a match. She wanted them to be able to leave the building. She wanted the building to survive. She carried the strongbox and the case and the journal across the grass to the tree line. She set them down at the base of a thick ponderosa pine behind the trunk, where they were hidden from the clearing. She covered them with a layer of pine duff. She drew her phone out of her pocket. She did not have signal here. She would have to go to the ridge to call. The ridge was a quarter-mile up the slope behind the building. It would take her 4 minutes to climb. 4 minutes was a long time. But 4 minutes was less than the time it would take 3 men to burn down a Quonset hut from the outside if they had no gasoline left inside it, because all the gasoline was on the outside of curved steel. And curved steel does not burn easily, and a Quonset hut is built like the hull of a ship. She thought, I need to get the gasoline cans out of their hands before I run. She moved. She circled the building wide through the trees, staying off the open grass. She came around the north side. She could see them now. 3 men. 2 of them she did not recognize. The third was Roland Vance. He was standing in the open between the lean-to and the tree line hands in the pockets of his charcoal wool jacket, watching the other 2 work. He was not carrying a can. He had brought the muscle. He was supervising. The 2 men with the cans were emptying them along the south wall. 1 can was almost empty. The other was about half full. There were 2 more cans sitting in the grass next to the lean-to. Addie crouched low at the edge of the trees. She thought, if I take the spare cans, they cannot finish the job. They will have to drive down to a gas station. By the time they come back, the deputies will be here. She moved. She came out of the trees behind the lean-to in the deep shadow, where the wooden wall blocked the light. She crossed the 8 feet of open grass between the trees and the lean-to in 3 quick, silent steps. She crouched beside the 2 full cans. She lifted them. They were heavy, 5 gallons each. She could carry 1. She could not carry 2 and run. She made a choice. She took one of the cans by the handle. She left the other. She turned and walked back into the trees with the can in her hand, careful, slow, no rush. She did not run. Running would have made noise. She walked. She made it back into the trees. She set the can down behind a fallen log. She came back out. She crossed the grass again. She picked up the second can. She walked it back into the trees. She set it beside the first. She had taken 10 gallons of gasoline out of their plan, and they had not noticed because Roland Vance was watching the south wall, and the 2 men with the cans were watching their own hands. Addie turned and ran. She ran up the slope behind the building. She ran through the trees, branches whipping past her face, her breath loud in her own ears. She ran until her thighs burned and her lungs ached. She came out onto the bare, rocky shoulder of the ridge above the clearing. She pulled her phone from her pocket. She had 2 bars of signal. She called Deputy Brennan. He picked up on the second ring. "Brennan, it is Adeline Thorne." Her voice came out steady. She did not know how. "3 men. They are at the Quonset hut. They have gasoline. They are trying to burn it. Roland Vance is with them." There was a single beat of silence. Then Brennan said, "We are coming. Stay where you are." She heard him already moving as he said it. Doors. A radio cracking. Another voice answering. The line went dead. Addie stood on the ridge. She could see the clearing below her, the pale curve of the Quonset hut in the starlight, the small dark shapes of the 3 men, a flashlight beam moving along the south wall. She thought I should go back. She thought I should make sure the building stays standing until they get here. She started back down the slope. She did not run this time. She moved carefully through the trees, watching her footing on the loose duff. She was about halfway down when she heard the sound. It was the sound of an engine. But it was not a patrol car. It was a pickup. The pickup was leaving. The 2 men with the gasoline cans had gotten back into their truck and were driving back down the dirt track. They had run out of fuel. They had looked for the spare cans and not found them and not understood and not wanted to wait around in the open for whoever had taken them. They were going to get more. She could see Roland Vance still standing in the clearing. He had not gotten in the truck. He was watching the building. His hands were still in his pockets. He was alone now. Addie stopped moving. She crouched in the trees and watched him. He stood there for a long time. He did not move. He did not call out. He simply stared at the Quonset hut as if he could open it with his eyes. The cold light of the half-moon caught the side of his face and turned it the color of bone. Then he walked toward the front doors. He tried the handle. The doors opened. She had left them unbolted. He went inside. Addie waited 4 full seconds. Then she came down the slope at a flat run. She did not bother being quiet. She came across the open grass in long, fast strides. She reached the front doors. She put both hands against them. She slammed them shut. She drove the heavy iron slide bolt across from the outside. The bolt seated home with a deep, cold clunk. From inside the building, a single, sharp sound, a surprised intake of breath. Then footsteps fast coming toward the doors. Roland Vance's voice came through the steel. "Open this door." His voice was calm. It was the calm of a man who had not yet understood that something had changed. Addie did not answer. She walked backward away from the doors, 10 feet, 20 feet. She stood in the open grass of the clearing with her hands at her sides, and she watched the doors of her grandfather's building, and she listened to the man inside. He hit the door once. It did not move. He hit it again. Harder. It still did not move. A Quonset hut has front doors made of 3-inch steel, set into a frame designed during the Second World War to keep heavy weather out of an airplane hangar. The bolt was iron. The frame was iron. Roland Vance was wearing a wool jacket and leather shoes. The doors did not move. He stopped hitting them. A long silence. Then his voice came again, lower this time, no longer calm. "Miss Thorne, you are making a mistake." She did not answer. "Miss Thorne, open the door." She did not answer. "Miss Thorne, we can still come to an arrangement, you and I." She did not answer. Far away on the county road below the clearing, she heard the sound of sirens. 2 of them, coming fast. Inside the building, Roland Vance heard them too. He went quiet. Addie stood in the cold grass and listened to the sirens come up the road. She listened to them turn onto the dirt track. She listened to them climb the last half-mile through the pines. She watched the red and blue flicker of their lights begin to play along the trunks of the trees at the edge of the clearing. 2 patrol cars came up out of the trees and into the open ground. Deputy Brennan was the first one out. He was a tall man in his 40s with a heavy mustache and a flashlight in one hand. He walked toward her across the grass. His partner stayed by the patrol car, radio in hand. The other car circled wide to cover the back of the building. Brennan stopped in front of her. "Miss Thorne, you are not hurt." "No." "Where are the others?" "2 of them left in a pickup 10 minutes ago. They went down the road for more gasoline. The 3rd is inside the building. I bolted him in." Brennan's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You bolted him in?" "Yes." He looked past her at the Quonset hut, at the doors, at the iron slide bolt set across them from the outside. He said very quietly, "All right then." He walked past her to the doors. He drew the bolt. He pulled the door open with one hand, his other hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Roland Vance came out into the cold air of the clearing with his hands raised and his face very pale. And he did not look at Addie at all as the deputy turned him gently against the side of the patrol car and put the handcuffs on him. The pickup with the other 2 men was stopped by the 2nd patrol car at a county road intersection 9 minutes later. They had not gotten as far as the gas station. Addie watched the patrol cars pull away with all 3 of them. The taillights moved down the dirt track and out of the clearing and disappeared into the pines. And then she was alone in the open grass, with the curved, dark shape of her grandfather's building behind her, and the cold mountain stars overhead. And her body began to shake finally in the way bodies shake when the thing that was going to happen is over. She walked to the tree line. She uncovered the strongbox and the black plastic case and the journal from under the pine duff. She carried them back inside the building. She set them on her bedroll. She fed the stove a careful armful of pine. She sat down on the bedroll with her back against the curved steel wall, and she put her hands over her face, and she sat that way for a long time. She did not cry. She did not know yet how to, but something inside her chest had finally come unstuck from the place it had been stuck for a long time. In the morning, she walked into town with the black plastic case under her arm. The pawn shop on the main street of Pine Hollow was open. The man behind the counter was perhaps 60 soft around the middle with thinning hair and tired, kind eyes. He looked at her over his glasses as she came in. He looked at the black plastic case under her arm. "Need to play something," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. He came out from behind the counter. He led her to a small back room with a single chair and a small color television set on a wooden stand. A VCR sat beneath the television. He turned both of them on. He stepped back. "Take as long as you need," he said. He closed the door behind him. Addie sat down in the chair. She opened the black plastic case. She lifted the videotape out of the foam. She slid it into the VCR. She picked up the remote. She pressed play. The screen flickered. A brief band of static. Then an image came up. Her grandfather was sitting on a wooden crate inside the Quonset hut. The Quonset hut. Her Quonset hut. She recognized the curve of the steel wall behind him. She recognized the cast iron stove in the corner of the frame. He was wearing a heavy canvas work jacket. His hair was white and thin. His face was older than the face in the photograph. Much older, the cheeks hollow, the skin paper thin. He had been very ill when he made this. She could see it in his eyes. He looked at the camera. He smiled. It was a small, careful smile. The smile of a man who was tired and who had something he needed to say. "Addie," he said. His voice came through the small speakers of the old television, slow and deep and patient. It was the voice she had not been able to remember. It came into the small back room of the pawn shop, and it filled the room, and Addie's hands closed on the arms of the chair, and she did not move at all. "If you are watching this," he said, "then I am gone, and you have found everything I left for you. The land, the building, the money, the papers, the truth about your grandmother, the truth about why I was not in your life." He paused. He took a slow breath. "I want you to understand something. The money in the jars is not a gift. I have written that already, and I will say it now. It is an apology. Not for the years I spent watching you from a distance. Those years I do not apologize for. Those years were the right thing for me to do, given what your father asked of me. I apologize, Addie, for the years before. The years I spent in Denver when I thought I could fix the world by saying the truth out loud. I apologize for what saying the truth cost your grandmother. I apologize for what it cost your father. I apologize that those costs eventually reached you." He stopped. He looked away from the camera for a moment. When he looked back, his eyes were wet. "I want you to know one more thing," he said. "The land is not a payment. I want you to understand the difference. The money was an apology. The land is a beginning. I bought it for you the year you were born. I built the inside of that building for you, every shelf, every wall, every nail, with the thought that one day, if the world was kind to you, you would walk into that clearing on your own 2 feet, and you would know what to do." He smiled again. The same small, careful smile. "I left you $10 to get in the door, because I wanted you to know, before you saw any of the rest of it, that you could afford it. That whatever you had in your pocket on the day you came, that was enough. Whatever you had, Addie, was enough." He paused. "Do not build the life people tell you to build. Build it with your own 2 hands. The way I try to teach your father, and the way your father, I hope, will one day forgive me for not being there to teach you. A foundation matters more than anything you build on top of it. You are the foundation, Addie. Not the building, not the money. You. Whatever you put on top of yourself in this life, put it on carefully, and put it on straight, and put it on with people who love you." He looked at the camera for a long moment. I loved you the whole time, he said. I loved you the whole time. The screen went dark. Then the static came back. Then a blue blank screen. Addie sat in the chair in the small back room of the pawn shop on the main street of Pine Hollow, Colorado, and she put her hands over her face, and finally, she cried. She cried the way a person cries when something that has been frozen for a long time begins slowly and patiently to thaw. She cried for her grandmother, who had set down a coffee pot and said, "Then you will not." She cried for her grandfather, who had loved her from across a doorway he had not been allowed to cross. She cried for her father, who had carried his own grief so badly that he had taken her grandfather away from her and then left her himself. She cried for the small girl in the red coat in the photograph, who had been carried in strong arms through a clearing in the mountains and who had not been allowed to remember. She cried for the girl who had walked out of the youth center 6 days ago with $43 in a manila envelope and no idea what she was walking toward. She cried for a long time. When she was finished, she rewound the tape. She took it out of the VCR. She put it back in the black plastic case. She turned off the television. She walked out of the small back room into the front of the pawn shop. The man behind the counter looked up at her. He did not say anything. He saw her face. He simply nodded. She walked out into the cold, bright morning of the main street of Pine Hollow. She walked to the brick building at the end of the street. She climbed the stairs to the second floor. She knocked on the door of Holden Pierce, attorney at law. She handed him the folder from the strongbox. She said, "I want to do what my grandfather did not get to do. I want to send this to the district attorney." Pierce looked at the folder. He looked at her. He looked at the folder again. He said, very quietly, "Then we will send it." The story did not end that day. The district attorney's office in Denver received the folder 2 weeks later. By certified mail with a cover letter Holden Pierce had drafted carefully over the course of 3 afternoons. The office assigned the file to a young deputy DA named Marisol Ortega, who had been waiting most of her career for exactly this kind of file. The investigation that followed took 9 months. Roland Vance was charged with attempted arson conspiracy and intimidation of a witness. 2 of the original Vance and Halverson principals were long dead, but the company itself and the estates of those principals were sued in civil court on behalf of the 2 children who had been injured in the gymnasium collapse 44 years earlier. The girl who had walked with a limp was now a woman of 53. She received in the final settlement enough money to retire. Addie did not testify. She was not asked to. The folder spoke for her grandfather, and her grandfather finally spoke for himself. She did not sell the land. She did not move into town. She stayed in the Quonset hut. She finished the work she had started. She framed 2 interior rooms with cedar lumber she bought from Bram Whitlock. She ran a water line up from the stream. She had a county electrician trench in a power line, and she paid for it with the money from one of the jars. She put new glass in every window. She painted the curved steel walls on the inside, a soft, pale white that caught the morning light. She built a porch on the front of the building just big enough for 2 chairs, and she sat on it most evenings as the sun went down behind the mountains. She opened 6 months later. a small carpentry workshop in a building she rented on the main street of Pine Hollow, 3 doors down from Whitlock's Hardware. She called it Thorn Woodworks. She hired no one. She did the work herself. In the second year, she began driving down to Boulder on weekends and teaching small free classes in basic carpentry at the youth center she had walked out of. She taught the boys and the girls the way her grandfather had wanted to teach her father, and the way her father had not been able to teach her. She taught them how to oil a hinge so a door would not shriek. She taught them how to measure twice and cut once. She taught them how to put a wall up straight. She taught them that whatever they had on the day they came was enough. On the last page of her grandfather's journal in his careful, slanted handwriting was a single line. She had read it many times. It was the line she came back to most often. She had it stitched eventually into a small frame sampler that hung beside the front door of the Quonset hut, where she would see it every time she came home. A foundation matters more than anything you build on top of it. One evening in late autumn, 2 years after the day she had walked into the clearing with an iron key in her hand and $43 in her pocket, Addie sat on the porch of the Quonset hut with a mug of coffee cooling between her palms, and the sun going down red and slow behind the ridge. The sky was the color of a copper kettle. The pines at the edge of the clearing were already dark. A pair of ravens crossed the open ground in a long, lazy line, calling to each other once, and then again. And then they were gone. She opened the journal on her knee. She turned to the last page. She read the line. She closed the journal. She looked out across the clearing she had spent 2 years learning to call home. "I understand now," she said, softly into the cold air, to no one and to someone. "I understand now, Grandfather." The wind moved through the tall grass at the edge of the trees. The first stars came out above the ridge, and Adeline May Thorne sat on the porch of the house her grandfather had built for her before she was born, in the quiet she had earned with her own 2 hands, and she finished her coffee in the dark.